Last month, I was working a wedding where my name wasn't on the guest list, only on the staff roster. I carried trays past people I'd known for years, listening to them whisper about my place in life. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. What they didn't know was that I had an invitation in my bag, and a date they'd never see coming. When I walked through those doors, every camera turned toward us, and the bride's smile vanished like it had been yanked off her face. Weddings are supposed to be about love, celebration, and maybe a little bit of gossip over the cake table. But for me, this one started in a black and white uniform, balancing champagne flutes on a tray, while the guests, some of whom I'd gone to school with, pretended not to recognize me. I could feel the glances before I even caught them. The smirks, the tilted heads, the half-hidden mouths behind manicured hands. I wasn't on the guest list. My name was printed on the staff roster, table service, row 3. To them, that meant I was part of the decor. Background. Invisible. Except invisible people don't overhear the way your name gets turned into a punchline. The bride had been part of my social circle in high school. We'd never been close, but we'd shared the same lunch table a few times, enough for her to know my face and my story. Or at least, the version of my story she decided was worth repeating. College dropout. Couldn't keep up with her friends. Ended up working wherever would take me. She never said it to my face. She didn't have to. I'd taken this catering shift because, frankly, I needed the extra cash. And because I thought maybe the wedding would be big enough, chaotic enough, that I could just disappear into the crowd of servers and leave without anyone noticing me. I was wrong before the first toast even happened. Near the bar, I caught my name. She's just a waitress now. It was said in a tone that stretched the word just until it almost snapped. I didn't look over. Didn't need to. I knew the voice. One of the bride's cousins, a girl who used to borrow my notes in chemistry. Back then, she'd been all smiles. Now, she was the kind of smile that cut. And the thing is, I let it slide. At first, it's not like I was there to make a scene. I had my job, my paycheck, and my shift end time. But sometimes, silence isn't peace. Sometimes, it's a fuse. In my bag, stashed in the staff room, was a dress. Not just any dress, but the one I'd bought weeks ago when an unexpected invitation landed in my inbox. Yes, an actual invitation to this wedding. It had come from someone the bride knew very well, though she'd never expected us to show up together. I'd planned to skip it. Then the whispers started, and the fuse burned shorter. By the time the main course was served, my mind was made up. I was going to clock out early, and I wasn't walking back into that ballroom alone. Little did they know, everything they'd whispered about me was about to become the background noise to something they'd never forget. The smell of roasted lamb and rosemary was heavy in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of spilled champagne on the carpet. I moved between tables, weaving around guests who never bothered to step aside, my tray growing lighter with every flute I set down. The clink of glass against glass was constant, a metronome to the low hum of conversations I wasn't meant to hear but couldn't help catching. At first, it was the usual wedding chatter. Compliments on the flowers, complaints about the seating chart. Then, from table 6, my name again. She's working here? Wow. The tone was coded in that fake sweetness people use when they want to sound surprised, but really mean pathetic. I didn't turn my head, but my ears locked on. I mean, I always knew she'd end up doing something like this. Another voice chimed in. She was never exactly ambitious. A soft ripple of laughter followed, muffled behind napkins. I kept moving, smile fixed, tray steady. Inside, my stomach was tightening, a slow knot that pulled harder with every step. The bride swept past me a few minutes later, arm looped around her new husband, radiant in a way that wasn't entirely about love. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge I existed. But her friends did. Their eyes flicked to me and then back to her, like I was some sort of private joke. It would have been easier if this were just strangers. But these were people I'd grown up with. People who'd sat next to me in classrooms, borrowed my pens, asked me for help on homework. And now, apparently, I was just the girl carrying their drinks. As I stepped into the kitchen to swap my empty tray for a fresh one, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. A text from him. Here. I stared at the single word, my pulse quickening. We'd talked about this, the possibility of him coming later in the evening. I hadn't been sure I wanted to go through with it. Not because I was embarrassed of him. Far from it. But because I knew that walking in with him would cause waves. Big ones. I set my tray down and took a breath, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. The kitchen was loud with the sound of pots clanging, waiters calling out orders, plates being stacked. But all I could hear was the echo of their voices from the dining room, the sharp edges of those words, "Just a waitress." I thought about the invitation in my bag, the one I'd been ignoring all evening, about the dress folded neatly beneath it, about the way the bride's world would tilt the moment she saw who I was with. I didn't know if it was revenge, self-respect, or something in between driving me toward that staff room. All I knew was that my shift suddenly felt very, very over. I clocked out early, the manager too busy with a broken coffee machine to notice. My heart was pounding, half from adrenaline, half from something I couldn't quite name. Maybe anticipation. Maybe the thrill of finally, for once, not swallowing the words I wanted to say. I slipped into the staff room, locked the door, and pulled the bag from my locker. The zipper sounded loud, final. And that's when I heard the knock. Not from the hallway, from the back entrance. Followed by his voice, low and unmistakable. "Ready?" I froze for a second, my fingers still gripping the zipper. Hearing his voice here, in this space where I was just part of the staff, felt almost unreal. I crossed the room and cracked the back door open, the cool night air rushing in like it had been waiting to take my breath. He was standing there in a tailored charcoal suit, looking like he'd just stepped out of a magazine spread. No tie, top button undone, a kind of casual confidence that could turn a hotel lobby into a runway. And when he smiled, it wasn't just for me. It was the kind of smile that made people turn their heads without knowing why. "Still want to do this?" he asked. His tone wasn't teasing. It was steady, like he'd follow my lead no matter what I decided. I hesitated, the sounds of the reception muffled behind the walls. Images flashed in my mind. The bride's narrowed eyes in high school when I made the honor roll, the whispered comments tonight about my place, the way no one at those tables thought twice about talking over me like I was furniture. Part of me wanted to disappear, just go home, and let them keep their little hierarchy intact. The other part, the bigger part, wanted to walk in there with him and watch the cracks form in their perfect picture. "You brought it?" I asked. He lifted a garment bag from his shoulder and unzipped it just enough for me to see the deep emerald green fabric glinting under the security light. My dress. Pressed, perfect, ready. I shut the door behind him and changed quickly, my server uniform pooling on the floor like shed skin. The dress hugged me in all the right places, the color pulling out a sharpness in my eyes I'd almost forgotten I had. I slipped on the heels I'd hidden in the bottom of my bag, my pulse sinking with each click against the tile. In the small mirror above the lockers, I barely recognized myself. Not because of the dress, but because of the way I was standing. Straighter, sharper, like someone who didn't need to ask for a place at the table, because she was about to walk right through the center of it. We stepped out into the corridor that led to the main entrance of the ballroom. I could already hear the music change, the DJ calling for the next dance set. Through the frosted glass of the doors, I saw shapes moving, lights spinning. And closer to the entrance, two of the bride's friends stood gossiping, their heads bent together like conspirators. They didn't see me yet, but when they did, I knew they'd nudge each other, maybe even laugh. That laugh wouldn't last long. As we paused just before the doors, he leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You know she's going to lose it when she sees me, right?" There was no arrogance in it, just a statement of fact. And that's when the realization hit me like a second heartbeat. They didn't just know me from high school. They knew him. The heavy double doors swung open without a sound, but it felt like the entire room exhaled at once when we stepped through. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The DJ's voice caught for a half-beat before rolling into the next track, and somewhere, a fork hit a plate with a sharp, metallic note. I didn't have to scan the room to know where the eyes were. They found us instantly. Not me, him. Even under the soft amber lights, he stood out. Not just for the suit or the easy, confident walk, but because every single person in the bride's orbit already knew his face. Some had smiled at it in old yearbooks. Others had kissed it. One had left it standing at the altar 5 years ago. Yeah, the man on my arm was her ex-fiancé. The realization didn't hit them all at the same time. It moved like a ripple, starting with the nearest tables, then spreading outward as whispers flared and eyes darted toward the head table. The bride's smile, the carefully composed one she'd been wearing all night, faltered. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the corners of her mouth softened, her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and her fingers tightened around her champagne flute just enough to make the stem creak. I felt the heat of every look on my back as we walked toward the bar. The ones from her friends were sharp with curiosity, edged with hostility. The older relatives watched with the kind of fascinated disapproval reserved for scandal they secretly enjoy. He ordered a drink like he'd been here 100 times, leaning casually against the bar while I scanned the room. Everywhere I looked, someone was pretending not to stare. "You're enjoying this," I murmured under my breath. "I'm enjoying you enjoying this," he said without missing a beat. Then, after a sip, "She looks like she swallowed a lemon whole." It wasn't about revenge for him. At least, not entirely. They'd ended badly. That much I'd known from the start. But he'd moved on long before I came into the picture. For me, though, this was different. This was every whispered insult, every side glance, every casual dismissal, gathered into one sharp, glittering moment. I caught sight of the bride moving toward us, her dress trailing like a wave of white silk cutting through the crowd. The groom trailed a few steps behind, his expression unreadable. She was smiling again, but it was the kind of smile you wear when you're bracing for impact. "I think you're about to get your first hello of the night," he said quietly. The room seemed to pull tighter around us as she approached, voices dimming, attention funneling toward this single point. I set my glass down, my pulse a steady drumbeat in my ears. When she stopped in front of us, she didn't look at me right away. Her eyes locked on him first, scanning his face like she expected to find something missing or broken. Then, slowly, her gaze shifted to me. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, someone behind her called out my name. My name, spoken clear and loud enough to slice through the murmurs, made the bride pause mid-breath. It came from somewhere behind her, deep, male, and immediately familiar. She turned just enough for me to see who it was. Standing near the cake table, one hand tucked into the pocket of his vest, was Daniel Harper, the bride's older brother. Of all the people in this room, he was the last one I expected to speak to me, let alone like that. In high school, Daniel had been a ghost in my periphery. Older, cooler, too busy with college applications and varsity sports to notice a sophomore carrying a secondhand backpack. The few times we'd talked, it had been polite, forgettable. But now, his expression wasn't polite at all. It was direct, focused, like he'd been waiting for me to arrive. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said when I stepped toward him, the bride and my date both watching the space between us like it was a fault line. I kept my voice even. I was working. Daniel's eyes flicked to the emerald green dress, then back to my face. "You don't look like you're working now." The implication hung there, that I wasn't here by accident, that this wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment decision. And he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. The bride moved to close the gap between us, her smile thin and almost brittle now. "She's here with him," she said, as if that clarified everything. Daniel's gaze shifted to my date, then back to me. Something unreadable passed over his face. Not anger, not approval, but a kind of calculation. "You two know each other?" I asked. Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "We've met," which, given the tension in his voice, could mean anything from a handshake to a fist fight. The music in the background seemed suddenly too loud, the bass thudding through the floor. Around us, the reception had slowed, people leaning in to catch fragments of the conversation. It wasn't every day that the bride, her ex-fiancé, and her brother stood in a loose triangle with someone just a waitress at the center. Daniel leaned a fraction closer, his voice low. "You might want to keep your guard up. She's not going to let this slide." The bride's eyes narrowed, the warmth in them gone entirely now. "This is my wedding," she said softly, each word clipped. "And I'm not going to have it turned into a circus." It would have been easier to bite my tongue, to let it go, to melt back into the background like they all expected. But I could feel the weight of every whisper from earlier in the night pressing against my ribs. And with Daniel's warning still in my ears, I knew this wasn't just about showing up with the wrong +1. Something bigger was brewing here. Something that made the bride look less like a humiliated hostess and more like someone cornered. Before I could respond, one of the bridesmaids appeared, breathless, leaning in to whisper something into the bride's ear. The color drained from her face in an instant. She turned on her heel without another word, gown sweeping the floor as she strode toward the far end of the ballroom. I looked at Daniel. What was that about? He didn't answer, just glanced toward my date and said, almost too quietly to hear, Looks like she just found out what you know. Daniel's words lodged in my chest like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. What you know. The thing was, I hadn't planned on using it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. 2 weeks ago, while working a private dinner at a downtown hotel, I'd been clearing coffee cups when I heard laughter coming from one of the smaller conference rooms. Through the cracked door, I saw the bride, still a fiancée then, with a man who definitely wasn't the groom. They weren't holding hands, but their body language was close enough to make it clear this wasn't a business meeting. And just as I started to back away, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. The man looked toward the door, and I recognized him immediately, the same guy who'd caused the groom to vanish from his own bachelor party early. I told myself it wasn't my business. People have their messes. People make choices. But then, a week later, I overheard the bride telling someone on the phone that she'd handled it, and that no one who matters will ever hear about it. The casual cruelty in her voice stuck with me, like a pebble in my shoe I couldn't shake. Now, standing in the middle of her wedding reception with Daniel watching me like he was waiting for a verdict, I felt the old knot of indecision pull tight. I could drop it. Let her have her night, her reputation, her perfect Instagram slideshow. Or I could drop it into the room like a lit match. Why are you looking at me like that? I asked Daniel. Because, he said evenly, you didn't come here just to make an entrance. You came here with ammunition. I wanted to argue. To say I'd only brought myself, my date, and a little self-respect. But I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Somewhere in my bag, beneath my lip gloss and phone charger, was my old work phone, the one I hadn't used in months. On it was a single audio file from that night at the hotel. Nothing explicit. Just enough laughter, pauses, and two familiar tones to plant a seed no amount of wedding cake could cover. I glanced toward my date. He was chatting casually with a cluster of guests, perfectly at ease, completely unaware of the silent war being sketched in my head. If I pulled the trigger on this, it wouldn't just humiliate the bride. It would scorch the entire evening. And some part of me still wasn't sure if that was justice or just cruelty. Daniel leaned closer. She's already panicking. If you wait too long, she'll spin it before you can say a word. I hated that he was right. And I hated even more that I could feel the pulse of the room shifting, whispers stretching toward us like threads. I stepped away, my heels clicking against the floor, the sound sharp in the temporary lull between songs. In the reflection of the tall windows, I saw the bride across the room, speaking in urgent tones to two bridesmaids. Her eyes flicked toward me once, twice, then stayed fixed like she could will me out of existence. Back in the staff room, I opened my bag and pulled out the phone. The screen lit up with the same photo I'd taken months ago, a skyline at sunset. My thumb hovered over the audio file. Just one press. And that's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. Not Daniel. Not my date. If you play that, a voice said, you'd better be ready for what comes after. I turned slowly, phone still in my hand. It was the groom. Up close, he looked nothing like the beaming man from the ceremony photos. His smile was gone, replaced with a kind of careful neutrality that made my stomach knot tighter. He shut the staff room door behind him, the latch clicking into place. You've got something, he said quietly. And I think I know what it is. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to see if he'd say it out loud. She told me you've always had a problem with her, he went on, stepping closer. That you like to cause scenes. There was no accusation in his tone, just a probing curiosity, like he was testing the edges of a knife. I met his gaze. And what do you think? His eyes flicked to the phone in my hand, then back to mine. I think you're about to do something she won't recover from. And I need to decide if I'm going to stop you or help you. That threw me. Of all the people in this room, he was the one with the most to lose if I detonated this thing. Why would you help me? I asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Because you're not the first person to catch her in a situation she can't explain. You might just be the first one with the guts to use it. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. This wasn't how I'd imagined it. Teaming up with the groom wasn't on my mental bingo card. But then again, neither was him knowing. He glanced toward the door. If you're going to do it now, before she gets her version out there. I looked down at the phone. The audio file's play button seemed to pulse with my own hesitation. Then, without giving myself another second to think, I hit send, forwarding the file to the DJ's booth number I'd quietly gotten from one of the sound techs earlier in the night. A plan I'd never intended to use until, well, now. The groom's eyebrows lifted just slightly, like he hadn't expected me to actually follow through. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Let's go watch the fireworks." We stepped back into the ballroom just as the music cut. The DJ's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the next dance." And then my audio file filled the room. The laughter, the hushed flirtation, the unmistakable familiarity of voices that weren't supposed to be together. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Every pause, every low chuckle spoke louder than any confession. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. The bride, halfway across the room, froze in place like someone had pulled the plug on her battery. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for the source, the culprit. And for one brief, electric moment, I felt the rush of victory. The whispers had stopped. The hierarchy had shifted. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. The file ended. The room stayed silent for a beat too long. Then the bride's voice, sharp and cutting, rang out over the mic she'd somehow gotten from the DJ booth. "Since we're sharing secrets," she said, her eyes locked on me, "maybe it's time everyone hears yours." Her voice was steady, but her grip on the microphone betrayed her. The knuckles were white, the tendons tight, like she was holding on to the last piece of control she had left. "See, she's not telling you why she's really here," the bride went on, turning in a slow half circle so her words could reach every corner of the room. "She's not here to work. She's here to get back at me. And it's not because of anything I've done tonight." I felt every gaze swing toward me again, hot and heavy. The DJ stood frozen, one hand hovering over the mixer, clearly unsure whether to cut her off. "She's had it out for me since high school," the bride continued, her voice gaining speed. "And you know why? Because she thinks I took something from her. But maybe she should tell you what she's been doing since then, who she's been seeing, what kind of deals she's been making." My pulse thudded in my ears. I could see the groom watching her from the edge of the crowd, his jaw clenched, but he wasn't moving to stop her. Daniel was closer, eyes darting between us, calculating again, like he was deciding which side to step toward. The bride turned, her gaze locking on me. "Should I tell them about the job you really had last year? The one that got you fired?" It was a bluff. It had to be. But the murmurs that rose up around the tables didn't care whether it was true. In a room like this, rumor was as good as fact. My date stepped forward, his presence cutting a line between us. "You're digging yourself deeper," he said, his tone low but carrying. She didn't even look at him. "Funny to hear that from you," she shot back, and that one sentence sent another ripple through the crowd. I realized, in that moment, she wasn't just lashing out blindly. She had a plan. She wanted to drag as many people into the mud with her as possible so no one could tell who was actually dirty. I could have fired back. I could have grabbed that mic and laid out everything I had in crystal clear detail. But some part of me knew she was counting on that. Counting on me losing control and making myself look as vindictive as she claimed. So instead, I smiled. Not a warm smile. Not an apologetic one. A smile that said, "You just told me you're scared." The crowd's attention wavered, split between us, hungry for the next blow. And then, from the far end of the ballroom, a man's voice rang out. Enough. It was the groom. He was walking toward us now, his eyes locked on his bride, each step measured. "You've said enough," he told her, taking the mic from her hand before she could react. For a heartbeat, I thought he was going to defend me, maybe even expose her fully himself. But instead, he turned to the guests, his tone calm but loaded. "We're going to take a short break. Enjoy some fresh air." The crowd hesitated, but the authority in his voice pushed them toward the exits, murmuring and stealing glances back at us. When the room had thinned to just a handful of people, Daniel, my date, a couple of the bride's inner circle, he turned to me. "We need to talk," he said, and then, to my surprise, added, "privately. Now." The groom led the way out of the ballroom, through a service hallway that still smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. I followed, my heels clicking sharp against the tile, the sound far too loud in the narrow space. We stopped in a small side lounge, a staff break room, but neater, with low couches and a wall clock ticking softly. He closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" I met his gaze. "I'm not the one who." "Don't," he cut in, holding up a hand. "You made your point in front of everyone. But I need to know how far you're planning to take this." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a man defending his bride out of loyalty. There was something else, a wariness, maybe even resignation. You already knew, I said. About her. About what I saw. His eyes flicked away for half a second, enough to confirm it. I knew pieces, he admitted. But people make mistakes. And there are reasons I went through with this wedding. It was almost laughable. Reasons? Like what? Keeping up appearances. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he rubbed his jaw, the first crack in his composed exterior showing. My family's business is tied to hers now. Contracts. Money. If this blows up tonight, it's not just a marriage ending. It's a merger collapsing. And there it was, the real chain keeping him here. It made my skin prickle, the thought that this entire night was less about vows and more about balance sheets. So you want me to just walk away? I asked. I want you to think about what happens after, he said. Because she's not the type to let this fade quietly. If you humiliate her in front of this crowd, she'll dedicate herself to ruining you. The irony hit hard. Ruin me? I was already just a waitress in their story. What else could she strip from me? But the truth was, I hadn't considered the long game. I'd been so focused on the satisfaction of the moment that I hadn't pictured the weeks or months after. The whispers in my workplace, the cold shoulders from people I didn't even know, the slow erosion of opportunities from doors she could quietly close. You're telling me to let her win, I said flatly. I'm telling you to be smart, he replied. We stood there for a moment, the clock ticking too loudly between us. My pulse felt heavy, like it had moved into my throat. Finally, he stepped toward the door. Whatever you do next, make sure it's worth the cost. He left without looking back. I stayed for a minute longer, staring at the muted reflection of myself in the window. The dress still fit perfectly. My hair was still flawless. But the certainty I'd walked in with was slipping, piece by piece, replaced by something I hated, doubt. And just as I started to collect myself, the door creaked open again. Only this time, it wasn't the groom. It was the bride. Her eyes were cold, her smile deliberate. She shut the door and said, "If you're going to threaten me, at least do it without an audience." She didn't sit. She just stood there, her hands loosely clasped in front of her like she was posing for a portrait, except her eyes gave her away. They were locked on me, sharp enough to cut. "Go ahead," she said. "Play whatever you've got. I won't stop you." The smile that followed wasn't friendly. It was a dare. I stayed silent, letting her fill the space. People like her hated silence. It forced them to show the edges they tried to hide. "You think you've won something tonight?" she went on. "All you've done is make yourself look bitter. Small." She tilted her head, the movement slow and deliberate. "You've confirmed every story I've ever told about you." That last part hit harder than I wanted it to. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't entirely untrue, not the facts, but the framing. If she controlled the narrative after tonight, she could paint me as unstable, vindictive, even obsessed. And the worst part? People would believe her. "What's your endgame?" I asked finally. Her smile didn't falter. "My life goes on. You go back to carrying trays. In a month, nobody remembers your little stunt." I took a slow breath, leaning forward in my chair. "See, that's where you're wrong. Because I'm not the one who's going to keep this alive. You are." A flicker of something, confusion, passed through her eyes. "You think you can bury this," I continued. "But you can't help yourself. You'll talk about it. Spin it. Retell it until you trip over your own lies. And every time you do, more people will ask what really happened. And the only answer they'll find is that recording." Her jaw tightened. "You're bluffing." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, not the old work phone, but my current one. I tapped the screen once, letting her see the post queued up on a private account with a simple caption, "Congratulations to the happy couple." The attached audio file was the same one that had played over the speakers. "You think I only had one copy?" I said. For the first time tonight, her smile slipped. "Just slightly. If you go after me," I said quietly, "if you so much as make one call to make my life harder, this goes live. Not to a room of 200 people, to a few thousand. And I promise you, they won't be as polite." We stood in that thick, electric silence for a beat too long. Then she straightened her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her gown, and said, "You're a lot colder than I remember." I didn't look away. "You should have remembered better." Without another word, she opened the door and left, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air like a taunt. When I finally stepped back into the ballroom, the crowd had shifted. Music was playing again, but the energy had changed, looser, messier. People were talking, but I could feel their eyes on me. Daniel caught my gaze from across the room and gave a small nod. Not approval, not pity, just acknowledgement. My date offered me his arm, and together we walked out, past the lingering guests, past the photographers pretending not to be listening, past the bride's perfect evening that would never look quite the same in anyone's memory. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. For the first time in hours, I felt steady, and I knew, without question, she wouldn't risk testing me again. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring past in the window. My date didn't ask for details, didn't push for a play-by-play of what had just happened. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough to know I'd gotten what I came for. By the time I walked into my apartment, the adrenaline was wearing off, replaced with a deep, bone-level exhaustion. I kicked off the heels, let the emerald dress pool at my feet, and stood for a moment in the half-light, replaying every frame of the night. The audio file stayed queued on my phone, still private, untouched. I didn't delete it. Not because I planned to use it. I'd already decided I wouldn't. But because it was my insurance policy, a reminder that I wasn't powerless, no matter how hard she tried to convince me otherwise. In the days that followed, the ripples spread. A coworker texted me a screenshot of a wedding guest's social media post, a candid shot of me and my date walking into the ballroom, captioned with a single word, "Wow." There were no details in the comments, just speculation. That was the beauty of it. I didn't need to explain. The mystery did the work for me. I heard, through the grapevine, that the honeymoon had been postponed. No one could agree on why. Some said the bride had fallen ill, others hinted at family business that couldn't wait. The truth, of course, was somewhere between damage control and escape. Daniel sent me a short message a week later. "She's been quiet. I think you got through to her." I didn't reply, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because the part of me that had needed validation from that family was gone. I wasn't in their orbit anymore, and I had no desire to drift back. At work, the whispers faded. Maybe people found new gossip to chew on, or maybe they realized I wasn't the easy target they'd thought I was. Either way, the air felt different, lighter. One night, as I was closing up at the cafe, my date came by. We sat at the corner table with the lights low, the street outside quiet. "You could have burned it all down," he said after a while. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. About the satisfaction I'd felt in the ballroom, the temptation to push just a little harder, to make the fall absolute. But in the end, the truth was simple. Because winning isn't always about destroying someone, I said. Sometimes it's about making sure they know you could, and choosing not to. He smiled at that. And for the first time since the wedding, I felt completely at peace. Not triumphant, not bitter, just done. The night of the wedding would fade in their memories, replaced with carefully edited versions and convenient omissions. But for the people who'd been there, the ones who'd seen the shift in the bride's face, the way the room tilted, the image would stick. And so would the unspoken understanding that I wasn't just anything. Some victories don't need applause. They just need to last. If you've stayed with me until now, thank you. Not just for listening, but for following every twist and pause, every moment where it could have gone completely off the rails. Nights like that wedding, they're not just about revenge. They're about clarity. The kind you only get when you've been underestimated, boxed in, and labeled, and you finally get the chance to decide how you'll be remembered. I could have gone further. I could have made sure the fallout followed her for years. But sometimes the most powerful move isn't destruction. It's restraint. It's knowing you can end the game at any time and letting your opponent live with that knowledge. So, tell me in the comments, have you ever had that moment where you held the winning card and chose not to play it? What made you hold back? Or would you have gone all in? If you want more stories like this, real, raw, and just a little bit ruthless, make sure you subscribe. There's always another twist coming.